Welcome to this special Legatum Institute interview with David Brooks, the New York Times columnist and author of a new book called The Road to Character. David, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
Key to this book is the idea of a difference between what you describe as eulogy virtues and resume virtues. Tell us what you mean by that.
The book starts with that distinction, and the idea is that we have certain virtues that go into making us good at our jobs, at our CV, whether we're good at accounting, good at law, good at medicine, good at teaching. And that's one set of virtues that we prize. But there's another set, which I call the eulogy virtues, which are the things they say about us after we're dead, where they're courageous, brave, honest, honorable, capable of great love. And I think most of us would care about the eulogy virtues a little more. We want to be known as deeply good people. And yet we live in educational institutions and within a society that emphasizes the resume virtues. And a lot of people are a lot more clear on how to build a career than on how to build a good inner character. And if you hang around a coffee shop and you overhear the conversations around you, they're likely to be more career conversations than moral conversations. And that's just the way our society is structured. But it leads to a withering away of the internal life. And the book is an attempt to find people who led amazingly good internal lives and just to figure out how they did it, and what can we learn from them.
And your sense is that fewer people are living by eulogy virtues today than was the case in the past. And in particular, I think very powerfully you express in the book institutions like the family, where children should be absolutely secure in their identity, where love should be unconditional, actually are places that parents are more interested in their kids' exam grades than necessarily their kindness or other aspects of the character. And you're worried that actually society is going in the wrong direction in which values it affirms most.
Yeah, and the family is an institution that is primarily a moral institution and nurturing institution, an emotional institution, and it's turning into the factory for achievement, strictly almost a market institution. And Harvard University surveyed 10,000 15-year-olds in the States, and they asked them, do your parents care more about your grades or whether you're kind? And 80% of the kids said, my parents care more about the grades. And that's certainly especially true among the educated classes, where they're training their kids from birth or pre-birth to get into the right university slot and to get the right job. And when the kids do what the parents like, they get the beam of love is strong. When the kids do what the parents don't like, the beam of love is withdrawn. And so the kids grow up with conditional love. And that's an extremely corrosive way to grow up, because you live in fear of losing your love of your parents, and you are unable to develop a criteria for your own success. And that's just one example of an institution that was primarily a moral institution turning into an achievement institution.
And why have you written the book? Because if I understand some of your other writings, particularly for the New York Times, you feel that America, Britain, is in large extent in a period of social repair, that a lot of our institutions, a lot of society is getting stronger. And how do you sort of put these two things together? One, this worry about how we are living our lives as individual people, and yet this social growth. Are you worried about our souls, or are you worried that actually, although there is social growth overall, for some people at the bottom, life is actually getting worse?
Yeah, well, it's certainly true that life is getting worse for some people at the bottom. I guess I'd say every age has its own problems and its own things it's good at. And I think our age has made tremendous gains in making life fair, less racist, less sexist. And so we've made gains in that. But we have our problems, and I'd say one of our problems is an excessive worship of self and a largeness of self, and maybe a narcissism and egotism. And to get to the next level, it's necessary to adapt a little deeper moral vocabulary. I don't think that we're bad necessarily. I think we're just morally inarticulate. We've lost a language to talk about these things. And without that language, you can't realize your most moral and most deep self. And so I do think this is something we can all work on to try to get better as human beings. And I wrote the book not because I was in any sort of crisis or midlife crisis or anything. I just wanted to be better. I wanted to see some people who are really just kind and good and radiate that goodness. And I wanted to be more like them, and I wanted to figure out how they did it. But I do think there's a social element too. I do think that in some sorts of disorganized parts of society, there's a lack of long-term thinking. There's a lack of the ability to control, self-control against impulses. And that's not just among the poor, it's among the rich and among every group. And that a lot of what we're trying to do in social policy is to get people to behave in ways where they're decent to other people. And that involves somewhat an economic language, but I think it also involves a moral language. And people only thrive when they're enmeshed in strong relationships. And if you're not constant, if you're not honest, you're probably not going to be enmeshed in strong relationships, and that has social effects.
And it's the decline of the moral language has coincided more than coincidence with the decline of religious observance, certainly in Britain, and I think increasingly in your own country. Fewer people going to church or synagogue, fewer people in large extended families. Is your book as much about community as it is about character?
Yeah, well, the two go hand in hand. People who have good character are able to commit to groups of people outside themselves, whether it's to causes, whether it's to neighborhoods, whether it's institutions. And so the two go hand in hand. The decline in faith is somebody else's business. I'm worried about the decline in moral language. And I do think whether you were religious or not, if you grew up in the Victorian era, if you grew up in the 1940s, you grew up with certain words floating in your heads. And you grew up with a certain logic floating in your head. And so one of the characters in the book is Dwight Eisenhower. He wasn't a particularly religious person, but he knew words like sin, he knew about virtue, he knew about vice, he knew about salvation, redemption, grace. He had the vocabulary just floating around in his head because it was in the air. And we now live...
And he also knew about suffering. You talk about the death of his son, one of his sons, and that sort of sense of hardship seems to be something perhaps a lot of us are less familiar with as well.
Yeah, fortunately, and I wouldn't want to go back to that kind of hardship where children were dying all the time. But and that's a good example. So we all have moments when we suffer, when something bad happens in life. And if you're armed with a certain set of ideas, a certain biblical viewpoint, then you can turn that moment of suffering into redemption. If you're not armed with the ideas, then often that suffering will just be painful and it'll shrivel you. And so we're confronted by these experiences in life. And the question is whether we make them moral occasions for something larger, for something higher, or whether they just become moments of which no good use and that become corrosive to us. And so that requires a certain literacy. And I'm afraid the literacy has diminished. It's just less in the air than when Dwight Eisenhower was around, let alone when George Eliot was around or when Abraham Lincoln was around. There are just certain moral categories that were in the air, certain practical reactions to hard experiences.
And although you say your book is primarily aimed at the individual reader, all of us to go on the journey that you've begun to explore, how do you be those more like those people you admire? There are clearly public policy implications of this. In a lot of your writings, you seem to think a lot of the problems of inequality, economic immobility are related to a lack of social capital in people's lives. In Britain, we've seen Steve Hilton, David Cameron's former advisor, write in similar terms, Robert Putnam with his Our Kids book. There seems to be a series of books at the moment saying actually social inequality is lying at the heart of these questions of economic inequality. Yeah. Are you optimistic that there are public policy solutions to this social inequality problem?
I think a lot of social inequalities interact with atomization and hyper-individualization, where people are cut off. They're cut off from ancestors and progeny. They're cut off from each other. And many people are living lives of either of gross excess or of solitude. And so building those relationships is in part a matter of social policy. It's a matter of community connection, but it's also part of moral quality. And if you don't have good moral qualities, you probably won't have strong connections. And I think most of what matters to us in life is not political. It's a matter of how we behave and the relationships we cultivate. But politics can certainly make it easier to be good if there are policies that nurture social capital. And that's really surrounding people in loving relationships. You can structure schools so that they're factories, or you can structure schools so that they nurture a loving relationship with a teacher. You can fund Big Brother programs or mentoring programs, or you can not fund those programs. You can have national service opportunities, or you can not have those service opportunities. So there are ways governments can nurture relationships, and there are ways governments can undermine relationships, often just by throwing money at things. And so the question for public policy is, what kind of relationships are we nurturing in this little nest we're building?
And you're worried that a lot of economic investment at the moment is at the wrong end of the generational scale. In Britain, we've just had a general election where more money was promised for retired people who are already now above average income, and more money would be taken away from working age families. There's a lot of vested interest in the way of your sort of agenda coming to pass.
Yeah, and we've done a great job of eliminating poverty among the elderly, but we've increased poverty among the young. And if you just simply look at where money goes, where it comes from, where it goes, government is a gigantic redistribution machine, taking money from the young and the struggling and handing it to the older and the affluent, and often through healthcare costs. And so somehow we've got to turn that around.
Well, David, I really enjoyed the book. It's full of great stories as well as moral challenges, and it's available now, published by Alan Lane, The Road to Character by David Brooks. And thank you very much indeed for joining us at Legatum Institute today.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you, Tim.
And thank you everyone for tuning in.